This next session is a fireside chat with Dr. Ethan Perlstein. It is my great pleasure to welcome, first of all, Erin Chown, who is a research coordinator with APBD Research Foundation. She will be facilitating the conversation with Dr. Perlstein. I'm also very pleased to welcome Dr. Ethan Perlstein himself. He is a biotech entrepreneur, a company builder, solo venture capitalist, an evolutionary pharmacologist. He is the founder and CEO of Perlara PBC, the first public benefit corporation dedicated to developing drugs for rare genetic diseases. Perlara leverages simple, genetically defined biological models to identify drugs that modify rare diseases and work to incorporate patient families into the drug development process. Prior to launching Perlara, Ethan held an independent postdoctoral fellow position at the Louis Sigler Institute of Princeton after completing his PhD at Harvard with Stuart Schreiber. I'm going to go ahead and pull Erin and Ethan up on the screen now.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Calliope. And good morning, Ethan. It's so nice to see you, and we are thrilled to have you with us here today, kicking off our first day of the APBD Scientific and Community Conference. So to dive right in here, we've heard a little bit about your background. I'm wondering if you could share with us a bit more about how you came to your role as CEO of Perlara.
Well, thanks everybody for having me here. It's great to see some familiar faces. Yeah, so it's been now, let's see. Perlara was founded in February 2014, so it's been quite a journey. But yeah, my roots were in academia, and I really wanted to be a professor one day. That was kind of what I wanted to do when I grew up. That was what all the people around me in grad school that I admired were doing. But I think I probably just didn't really understand it or appreciate it until much later. But I think I was set on an entrepreneurial path, even though I was still in academia at that time, because I was doing stuff that was sort of off the wall, like giving yeast Zoloft and making them overdose and using that to, using genetics to exploit understanding the pharmacology of this and seeing if it's relevant in a human or higher organism. So I was always sort of doing things that were a little bit not fitting neatly into, say, the applied or clinical side versus the basic or discovery side. I wanted to try to meld both together. So, fast forward to 2013 at my first rare disease day, and I met a parent who just started talking to me about their disease, and it felt like I was talking to a scientist about the disease. And come to find out, this parent was not trained in science at all. In fact, comes from the internet marketing world, but was, because of the urgency and because of the situation, was going to just simply learn the science. There was just no question that was what had to happen. So when I understood that there were these extremely highly motivated families out there, the next insight was, well, there's also a bunch of extremely highly motivated scientists out there who want to help them. And I think that was really insight of what what is Perlara, although it's taken several twists down the pike as a business. And yeah, I think today we are a cure consultancy, and we're trying to harness the brain power of cure guides or PhD scientists or PhD MD PhDs or whatever alphabet soup follows, but scientists who want to help and serve families and foundations like yours, like this community, and help them on a cure odyssey. Because I think that the word cure is something we should all be embracing in this day and age. So. Yeah, I could kind of go on about that, that thesis, but maybe I'll just sort of pause there.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And your work, I think, reminds me so much of the proverb of where there's a will, there's a way, and exactly what you just alluded to, of seeing that there is absolutely no shortage of will among people who are affected by rare diseases and the patient organizations representing them, and bringing together the relevant stakeholders and also bringing your expertise to the table to find that way. And to dive a little bit deeper there, I've heard you use the word cure guides, and I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit more what a cure guide is, and maybe give us a bit of a deep dive in terms of the evolution of Perlara over the years.
Yeah, so thanks again for the opportunity to talk about this. So I guess I was the first cure guide when it dawned on me that I could basically be consulting as a CSO, effectively a chief science officer for a particular family. And this first insight came when I got connected to a guy named Rohan Seth, who's on a Cure Odyssey on behalf of his daughter Lydia, KCNQ2, and we just ended up living a mile away from each other in Oakland. Both founders, and he comes from the tech world, and I'm from the biotech world, but we instantly kind of got along. But I also realized I was serving a very crucial function for him at that juncture, which was trying to provide this unvarnished scientific advice, although as though I was a financial advisor, but I'm advising him on like what strategies to use to potentially fix his daughter's mutation. But still this concept of, I could be pairing up, even if it's one-on-one with an individual parent, even and boiling it down to an N of one proposition and saying, hey, there's something here. This connection is something here, and then that really became the core of this insight of turning Perlara into a marketplace where cure guides could be matched up with families seeking to go on guided cures. So, but that insight took 8 years and a lot of heartache and a lot of experimentation on the business side and on the science side to figure out what was the actual right path for the company to take in order to best serve its mission. So, Perlara One starts in 2014, really as a, plucky academic, spin out. And that's effectively what it was, without any IP, but still coming out of an idea that was incubated in academia, and set it up as a conventional, biotech startup. At that time, though, we were accessing laboratory space biotech laboratory space that we could rent by the month, by the bench, and that was starting to become a concept back then. And now I think it's more taken for granted, but it was still maybe a little bit frontier back then. But now it's commonplace. Anyway, we set up the company to focus on a lead program, and initially the business orientation was to present ourselves as a platform company for pharma and say, hey, we're going to do all these screens for you in the rare disease space and use these model organisms and be able to potentially be a lead discovery engine for the company. So I think that was validated by a partnership with Novartis, but it became clear that wasn't going to scale. That weren't going to be enough big companies that were going to want to use this platform, and that was just kind of the reality. But there was at the same time, there was an insight that, there were people who were interested in using the platform, and they were all families who wanted to go on these cure odysseys. So yeah, and then we were we were constructed as a PBC, a public benefit corporation, as I said, the first one in biotech. There have been others that have followed, like Mark Cuban's Cost Plus Drug Company and Rarebase, and I hope others will join the fold. And then there was this hiatus period, and Perlara 2 was reborn last year. And that was really based on the fact that this other entity called Maggie's Pearl came into existence and really validated the idea that Perlara could partner with a family and create a joint venture called Maggie's Pearl that would commercialize a particular medicine, in this case, a repurposed drug. But that was really the whole reason to set up the PBC in the first place, was to show that this is a different way of doing pharma. Really truly putting patients first, not just talking about it like a slogan, but building companies with them. So Maggie's Pearl was the first example of that. And then Perlara 2 came into existence because I realized, thanks to the pandemic, that we could now build this cure consultancy. That insight I had of working with one parent could be scaled because of technology, because of Slack and other apps that allow a team of scientists to work around the world asynchronously or synchronously to help families wherever they are. So the whole thesis of Perlara 2 is we now have a much more efficient, in terms of a business engine, much more efficient way of identifying these next Maggie's Pearls opportunities.
Yeah, absolutely. And congratulations for your work with Maggie's Pearl. I think that's just really a wonderful story. And maybe we'll have time to dip back into that a little bit later as well. But just hearing you speak, it really sounds as though so much of your work strives to empower families and foundations to become involved in accelerating drug development for rare diseases and to pursue innovative approaches. And I was wondering if there were any interesting trends or kind of interesting case studies that you have heard of recently with regard to the role of patient advocacy organizations in accelerating drug development for rare diseases.
Yeah, I think there's a great example of the Chordoma Foundation setting up something called the CF Lab, not cystic fibrosis, obviously, but Chordoma Foundation,
Yeah.
and they're doing kind of what I did 8 years ago when I built Perlara or Pearlstein Lab at the time, which was I'm going to go rent lab space. Because there was the concept of a virtual model where you could hire CROs and manage them to do the research, but that's in practice, if that works out in practice, then you're really lucky, actually. And if it works out where it's not busting the bank and actually a collaborative process, well, then you found a great CRO. But that's the rarer experience. I think the more common experience is that it's really high cost, especially these one-stop shop CROs, these mega CROs, and the alternative of working with individual academic labs and all the entanglements with technology transfer offices and all that, and just the slowness of academic research. So the foundation was like, why do I have to settle for these two kind of suboptimal choices? Let's just rent lab space at a biotech incubator, just rent it by the month, just as though we were a company. And I'm sure on the lease, it's called CF Lab LLC or whatever they've called it. And I'm sure it's an entity owned by the foundation. And they get to now channel their donor funds or whatever way they're sponsoring the research. They get to now hire their own scientists, do their own experiments on their time. So I think that is now, we're at the inflection point. And I think in 5 years, foundations that are not doing this will become dinosaurs, and that the foundations of the future will be foundations that channel their dollars into a lab, a lab pipeline and workflow that they control. So I'm really excited that that's happening, and I'm seeing it across the country. I'm seeing it with another group working with in Texas that's going to be focusing initially on antisense oligonucleotide strategies. And there's even in San Francisco, we're working with a family, and we're kind of, it's still maybe a step up from a biohacker space, but still a space that was able to do COVID testing during the pandemic. So there's a lot of space at these different tiers and these different price points where you could go in as a family, individually, or as a foundation, and be able to now own your own, control your own supply, as we call it. And I think that is, and I think that the mindset of, pharma may I, the mother may I mindset, I think that still honestly is the mindset of many foundations, even research-focused foundations today. That's going to go the way of the dinosaur.
Yeah, it's definitely, some of these examples that you've shared, I think it's such kind of an inspiring time to be involved in this space. I know with the APPD Research Foundation, we're so fortunate to have been a part of several different rare disease patient organization communities, including the Chan Zuckerberg Initiative, Rare as One Network, and just to see, the whole range of different models and innovative models that these other patient advocacy organizations are, experimenting with or pursuing and pushing forward. I think it's a really interesting time to be involved in this space, and just, again, that kind of empowering message of, there's a multitude of ways that drugs can be developed and moved forward. So if one door closes, to build the next door, so to speak. So absolutely. And speaking of which, today we are so thrilled. We'll be hearing a range of updates from a number of drug development research programs, and they'll kind of span the whole gambit from small molecules to antisense oligonucleotides to gene therapies, and also a range of approaches as well. So from kind of smaller mutation-specific approaches that might be more of an N of one or an N of few, through to approaches that are anticipated to be applicable for a range of diseases, whether that's the spectrum of GBE1 deficient diseases or a collection of diseases where polyglucosome bodies accumulate. So to start on kind of the smaller side of those things, could you explain to us a little bit what an N of one or an N of few is, and the value of that to the broader disease community? And again, I think this ties in a little bit with your success with Maggie's Pearl specifically.
Yeah, so I think Emil Kakis, the founder and CEO of Ultragenyx, I think was once interviewing him on a Gene Fixer show on Clubhouse, talking
Mhm.
about this N of 1 to N of few approach, and he sort of said, "Oh, you mean ultra rare drug development?" And I think that's kind of just N of 1 is a restatement of that, and I think it's maybe it feels like it's a new concept, but N of 1 is not a new concept at all in the history of medicine. In fact, several Nobel laureates have won Nobel Prizes for doing experiments on themselves. So again, I'm not saying rush out and go self-experiment if you don't need to, but I think the N of 1 approach shouldn't be seen as some kind of scandalous or subversive concept. It's simply the practical reality of, well, if you have an ultra rare disease population, how many patients can you practically start out with? So there will be a first, and then there'll be a few fast followers. So I like to sort of recast it as a pioneer approach. N of 1 just sort of this just numerical, mathematical, cold. I think pioneer and maybe the pathfinder. I know there's other synonyms out there, but that metaphor I think is more accurate, because N of 1 doesn't necessarily give you this sense that there are numbers beyond 1. And people have to then sort of say N of few, and there is no elegant way to sort of then mix the mathematical metaphor with, or the mathematical concept with like an emotionally appealing metaphor. But I think pioneer for me resonates because it signals that there's going to be there's going to be a community that's going to settle here, and there's someone kind of going out, and that's in the history of evolution and the way species evolve. Like, I think this is also maybe a kind of resonant metaphor. But but if you just want to be practical about it, like Emil Kakis will just say, yeah, this is ultra rare drug development, and you're going to start out with a few. And I think maybe the cool innovation is that if we can bundle up a few of these N of 1s into a phase 1, or even into effectively a phase 1/2, which is kind of what we did with Maggie's Pearl and a power stat, then I think that's the real power of using that concept, because then you can now really, I think, accelerate clinical development, especially for repurposed agents. And then I think ASOs come up next because they're programmable, and there's certainly still tox issues, but like they could come up next, and then a novel small molecule could be coming up after that. But yeah, I think ultimately you start out with a few patients, because in ultra rare, that's where we have no choice.
Yeah, absolutely. And also, what you kind of said, this pioneer approach of anything that moves forward, my understanding is that gives the opportunity as well for additional collection of natural history data, so information about the disease, and potentially thinking through outcomes or biomarkers that might be effective and then could be used in some of these larger studies as well.
Exactly.
Yeah, absolutely. And then on kind of the other side of the spectrum, though, it is definitely still ultra rare drug development. But I think we're kind of in a fortunate position, so to speak, within the APBD community, in that many of the therapies that are being developed would be anticipated to be effective for a number of different diseases, whether, as I mentioned, that's the GBE1 deficient diseases or the polyglucosan body accumulating diseases. So do you see, in your work, opportunities for disease communities to really work together to advance some of these mutually beneficial therapeutic options?
Yeah, I mean, we're kind of it's really happening, as I said, right now, this inflection point where families are all realizing, well, we can individually spend, say, $150,000 as a family pursuing some kind of, drug repurposing, or we could join up with a couple of other families that are all doing, say, high content screens with fibroblasts. And you could say, well, you're all going to use the same type of experiments and workflow. So you could have the same scientist, even, or a group of small group of scientists doing these experiments. And you can do this in a way where, yeah, you're doing this for a few months, and you're on short-term or medium-term or month-to-month lease with your lab space. And then you get your answer, and then maybe you go back to a CRO to do certain screening steps, because that industrial step is still maybe more cost effective there. But you could see, as families start to kind of coalesce around common modalities or common unsolved questions that could benefit from communal resources, communal brain power, like that organizing is starting to happen. So there's just enough of you that it's like a simple economic calculation. Do we spend more alone, or do
Mhm.
we pool resources and get economy of scale? And yes, I think before the pandemic, it would have seemed like going to Mars to say to a family or a foundation, yeah, why don't you just go rent lab space? And although it's been happen, right? ALS TDI, there have been examples of it here and there, but it was never just sort of like assumed that that was the way it works. It was always assumed, no, you just have to go out there and go cultivate a network of researchers and academia, of course, and then and then CROs, if you can afford them, then you'll go there, and then you'll kind of just like basically just pray and beg that pharma will notice you at some point. Someone will pick it up, right? That's been kind of essentially the model. But yeah, and then of course there's been some venture philanthropy that's happened with Cystic Fibrosis Foundation, but they're a massive rare disease, right? Let's be honest here. That was thousands of patients, tens of thousands plus patients as a donor base to begin with, right? But for the ultra rares, I think they're realizing there's strength in numbers, they organize, and yeah, there's kind of no turning back once you go down this path. So that's why I'm saying I think in a few years, foundations that are not jumping on this train are not either doing this themselves or banding together and syndicating and then getting access to lab space and resources as groups. If they're not doing that, they're going to be left out in the cold. And I think donors are also going to come to expect now that, hey, these dollars are going to be spent on, and I can transparently see exactly where the research outputs are, and everybody can. So I think it actually should make everybody happier. Maybe should even help maybe with donor fatigue, because now you can actually see it's not just like, yeah, we gave this grant to this professor, and then we just really hope that they gave us a data update, and 12 months later, when we got no answer, we're like, well, what do we do? Like, no, those days are done.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And exactly as you said, just, it makes sense if there's, multiple ultra rare diseases to combine our energies and efforts to try to advance these therapeutics. And I think we're so grateful for the many other disease communities in this space that are kind of similarly aligned, and hopefully we can collectively push these therapeutics forward. And I know we are about to wrap up here, so I'll ask you my final question here. I think you just bring this incredible energy and passion to your work and to our discussion here today, and making us, think bigger and pushing us to be as innovative as possible. I know that the work of drug development for ultra rare diseases also requires much perseverance and tenacity. What keeps you going?
I think now it's just this feeling of having been in this space for almost a decade and seeing all the frustrations but all the successes that have happened as well, and just really feeling like this is the moment where this is going to start to scale. And as someone who's now basically become a Bay Area founder and have embraced my adopted home and mentality, like that ultimately now is what makes me so excited. Is I'm essentially a second time founder with the same company, having learned all those hard mistakes, and now get to build, I think, a much more interesting company, also in a landscape and an ecosystem with other great builders and other great partners. So I guess what keeps me going now is just the fact that all the hard work of the last decade, tilling that soil, now is the time to plant those seeds. And I'm so excited to see sort of what blossoms quite quickly, I imagine, in the months and years ahead.
Yeah, absolutely. No, I think that's beautiful. And similar notes that bring everyone to this conference today and tomorrow as well, of just that hope that this is, really a ripe time for innovation and for things to move forward, and really starting to see some traction there. So with that, I would like to thank you so much for joining us today. It's just been a pleasure to speak with you, and really wonderful to kick off the day. And